Reglamento de Esclavos, Chapter 5, Article 2, 1826. On leaving for work, each slave will be given the tool he needs for his activities of the day, and it will be collected from him and returned to the storeroom when he has finished work. Psalm 137, verse 3, approximately 597 BC. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Genovia Chase, House of Lanvin, Facebook post 2018. Ballroom is not fantasy. It is the real world reimagined. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out. The piece that I'm about to perform is structured around 11 gestures or motions that are going to form a recurring vocabulary. This vocabulary is going to be repeated in 3 iterations within 3 separate acts. Act 1, theft. Trans and queer inmates develop pop, dip, and spin, a rhythmic approximation of the pomp and strut of runway models. Only after the form is exported to the larger ballroom scene does it begin to be referred to as vogue, after the high fashion magazine from which dancers borrow their angular poses. The form is conceptualized, almost inevitably, as a desperate yearning for the trappings of wealth, less frequently as theft, committed by the stolen. In the first act, the 11 motions are lifted from their respective contexts and performed in isolation while being described literally. Raise both arms directly above head, palms facing outward. Extend left arm at an angle. Wag pointer finger. Open both hands at waist level, palms facing outward. Grab shirt collar with right hand, rub right cheek, display clean cloth. Extend left arm, hand flat, palm facing downward, parallel to the ground. Extend right arm, hand flat, palm facing downward, parallel to the ground. Touch fingertips of left hand to left temple. Draw right hand in a circle around the head, palm facing inward counterclockwise. Place left palm on breastbone. Place right palm directly beneath navel, elbows out. Touch fingertips of right hand to floor, brushing forward in sweeping motion. Rub palms together at chest level. Blow breath into cupped hands. Inventory. References the Old Testament. References Vogue magazine. References plantation labor. References kung fu movies. References Exodus. References the Kikongo. References Spanish court dances. References Psalm 137. References gymnastics. References the Yoruba. References a now lost dialect. References the catwalk. References the lukumi. References Matthew 25:23. Is practiced in the yard. Is practiced Saturday night. Is practiced at the bate. Is practiced during rec time. Is practiced in the park. Is practiced in the afternoon. Is practiced in the club. Is a practice. Is practiced in private. Is practiced on the water. Is practiced on the corner. Is practiced in secret. Is practiced Sunday morning. Calls itself master. Calls itself Lord. Calls itself keeper. Calls itself patron. Calls itself everything. Calls itself shepherd. Calls itself house. Calls itself father. Calls itself dueño. Calls itself mother. Calls itself the Alpha and Omega. Is a drag of the sacred text. Is a drag of the planters. Is a drag of the master class. Is drag. Drags the masters. Drags the scripture. Drags the imperialist. Drags the word. Calls us servants. Calls us flock. Calls us sinners. Calls us kept. Calls us initiates. Calls us sheep. Calls us practitioners. Calls us children. Gives the call. Renames the saints. Renames the limbs. Renames the west. Renames the blood. Renames the chapter. Renames the tongue. Renames the island. Renames the motherland. Renames the mother. Renames the never named. Names the unnameable. Holds the pose. Grinds the cane. Tugs the skirt. Swings the machete. Frets the palms. Encircles the head. Shakes the fingers. Rips the page. Pounds the chest. Spreads the arms. Breaks the wrist. Catches the breath. Binds the stalk. Lifts the hand. Surrenders the spirit. Act 2. Mockery. Bomba is birthed when land-owning planters pass their discarded formal wear onto their slaves, finding humor in seeing black servants dressed in the regalia of the elite. The slaves, clear they are being mocked, don the robes and mock the masters, promenade with arms outheld, imitating the haughty demeanor of Spanish court dances. Amused by the vulgar display, the planters passively condone their own property, ridiculing them in the open. In the second act, the 11 motions are assigned dual competing interpretations. Giving up, giving in. Rejecting, witnessing. Imploring, exposing. Defying, conforming. Passing on, passing over. Breaking, bearing. Suspecting, ignoring. Lifting, losing. Listening, hearing. Rooting, dragging. Weeping, shouting. Homily. What does it mean for an enslaved people to adopt the symbology of their own enslavement as the primary metaphor for freedom? Old spiritual, soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God, where God is Jah, Jah, a shortening of Jehovah, which appears some 50 times in the Hebrew Bible, 24 of those within the larger utterance, Hallelujah. Slaves in colonial Jamaica, made to study the Old Testament, reinterpret Exodus as the epic of their own exile, refer to the West as Babylon, the motherland to which they believe they will one day return, Zion. Not to be confused with Zionism and its innumerable logics of detention. Rikers Island, named in part for Richard Riker, 19th century lawyer who takes particular pleasure in returning black Northerners to their former Southern owners. Incarcerated queens, vogue, before the induction of the term vogue, entertaining their fellows in bondage. How can we sing King Alpha's song, In a Strange Land? Some of y'all might be familiar with the Melodians' 1970 rendition. It being impossible for niggas to have the intellectual dexterity to warp the concept of their own captivity in on itself. Well done, servant. That's what I want my Lord to say. Survival, while insufficient, is still an act of defiance. Few recall Jesus declaring, "I came not to bring peace, but a sword." Crucifixion, after all, state-sanctioned violence. State-sanctioned violence, crucifixion, rakia, demo, Maya, Quintonio, Kiki, DeCynthia, Ronnie Man, Sandra, Laquan, Laylene, Charlena, D'Angelo, Betty, Kiwi, Ayana, Corin, Titi. Each speaking of their names lays Pax Romana bare. Insists the empire has no democracy to spread. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. The subtext being, our captors are not bound for the milk and honey land of their own invention. Ponce, 1826. Slaves plan armed insurrection under the pretense of a dance and drumming circle known as a bombazo. After the failed conspiracy, conspire literally meaning to breathe together. Gobernador Miguel de la Torre issues formal decree increasing foreman oversight and restricting mobility. Think no-fly list. Think no-fly zone. Think one bright morning when my work is over. And haven't we always named liberation through the syllables of enslavement? Is Zion behind or ahead of us? To whom is the machete loyal? In that great getting up morning, where we finna fly to? Act 3. Reclamation. Jesus' disciples adopt the phrase, good news, from the decrees of Emperor Caesar Augustus, who employs the term to mean news from the front, expansion of domain. The subverting of the phrase on the part of early Christians intends to communicate that grace flows only from God, that the fall of empire, not its expansion, is good news. In the third and final act, the 11 motions are ascribed titles in an acknowledgement that they have taken on an entirely new meaning as distinct from their original context. Surrender. Disbelieve. Possibility of revelation. Prove. Those that came before, those that have yet to come, doubt, clear, intuit, remember, revive. Deterioration. On leaving for work, each slave will be given the tool he needs for his activities of the day, and it will be collected from him and returned to the storeroom when he has finished work. On leaving for work, each slave given the tool he needs for his activities of the day will be collected and returned to the storeroom. Each slave, on leaving, collected the tool, returned to the storeroom, finished work. On leaving for work, each slave sang, "Hallelujah, by and by." Each slave, on leaving, by and by, returned to work as determined by the given tool. Each tool, by and by, collected from the storeroom, given work. Each slave, a storeroom, saying, "When I die," waited for work. The tool sang in the slave's hand, by and biding its time. Each slave sang, "Swing low, sweet chariot," swung the tool above his head. Each slave sang, steal away. By and by, stole a tool from the store, room above the slave's head filled with what the slave sang. Each slave sang, "Estoy buscando un árbol," crouched behind the storeroom, waiting for the work. Work, slave, work. Shady place to lay down, by and by the riverside. Each slave a study, burdened and by. Each tool, buscando un árbol. What is the primary metaphor for freedom? Each slave sang, "Swing low and behold that beautiful shore." By and by, held the tool above his head, clenched his jaw, stole himself. Haven't got long to stay here behind the storeroom. Hallelujah, held his breath, and by each tool, leaving for the sweet, by and by, each slave, tool in hand, raised his hand above his head, by and by, waved goodbye, and by and by and by and by, and clenched, and by and by and by and by and by and by, and held, and by and by and by and by, and breath, and by and by and by and by and by and by and by, and leaving, and by and by and by and by and by and by and by, y buscando, and by 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 and by, and returned, and by 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 and waiting. think we're ready for the, we can do the talkback whenever you all are ready. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Mo.
So good to see you.
You too. Do we need, I don't know if we need like mics or any of that type of stuff.
I think I can fill the space.
Okay, okay.
Wow.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, hello everyone. Good evening. I am Kristiana Rae Colón, and I am so deeply honored to be sharing this space with you. First and foremost, thank you, Benji, for giving us this great gift tonight. And for allowing so much beauty to come through you. There's so many things that I'm struck by. One of them is the way that repetition transforms energies and ideas in this piece. In that last bit where you are repeating the word by and by and by and by and by and by, I first heard it as a farewell, a dismissal, and then like by and by we are waiting for our salvation and waiting and waiting and waiting, and then I heard it as this like frenzy of consumerism that we buy and we buy and we buy and we buy and we buy. And I think, you know, it was in watching you transform the word that it became transformed for me, and that like all of that genius bubbled to the surface. And that happens in so many places throughout. So thank you for that and for that roadmap. The first question I want to ask you is kind of personal, but I'm going to share something kind of personal to kind of balance it out. So I have recently started doing the Artist's Way, which is a practice and a framework that sort of uses spirituality as a guide for creatives to get back in touch with their creativity. And in this piece, like, there are obviously sources and musics that are explicitly a part of, you know, spiritual expression, gospel and bomba. I'm sure many would argue vogue as well. And I'm curious to what extent you consider your creativity a spiritual practice.
I love that question, and I think I absolutely do, and that is what is kind of, I think, revealing. I think, especially with these specific art forms and sort of Black diasporical art forms, is the deeper you dig into them as a practice, the more there isn't really a clear distinction between those two things. They don't feel like distinct things. It's a healing practice, it's a spiritual practice, it's an ancestral practice, it's a therapeutic practice, and at a certain point it's kind of hard, or maybe even like not necessary, to kind of draw those lines or distinguish between those things. And I think spending time with these three art forms in particular was probably spiritual in ways that I didn't predict or that I didn't anticipate, and I think also very challenging for me to sort of have to be confronted by the practices of my ancestors or the practices of other people, other folks in Black diaspora and in Black history, and how different some of the approaches sort of inherent to these art forms are from my own approaches, or how differently bomba as a practice or vogue as a practice understands these systems and structures than I understand them, and how are these art forms actually forcing me to re-examine some of my own political and spiritual orientations in ways that are actually really challenging and yeah, I think that was something I spent a lot of time with working on this piece, being like, oh, I think of capitalism in this way, or I think of the prison system in this way, and people in my own lineage who were grappling with or experiencing those things in ways so different from me were also conceiving of them totally different, and their relationship to them looked totally different. And yeah, just I think that in and of itself was a spiritual. There's just like a lot of communication with people whose names I don't know and who I've never met, but who were teaching me these things by way of movement and by way of really sitting with these practices and thinking about when my folks created this, for what reason did they create it, or what were the circumstances against which they were struggling or resisting that made this necessary, and how are those aligned with, but then at other times very different or even misaligned from my orientation and how I'm experiencing them. And that was challenging, and I think actually had some like hard moments as a result of that, but I think in some really like important, like spiritually important ways.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the hard moments. In my reading about your development of this piece, like you mentioned that it took like 6 years to develop, and that in that time there were lots of pauses. There was starting and restarting. There was kind of this, circuitous winding road to finding this structure that was different from other pieces that you've done. And that is what made me think about, like, well, in those, the sound of that is like terrifying to me personally as an artist. Like, those moments of pause are the moments when I'm like panicking, like, am I really doing it? Like, I'm not working hard enough. And I thought it was just so beautiful, like the peace and positivity that you framed, like the amount of time that you took with the piece and really finding it and allowing it to find you, which I think is really important in like the gift that you then get to deliver to the world. So thank you for that patience and for sticking with it and digging in. Another thing that I was really struck by, like in reading about it, bomba, vogue, gospel, I was expecting like bombastic music and lots of sound and for it to be very loud. And I was really struck by that it was kind of an a cappella performance, and that a lot of the sound, other than your voice and the spoken word, was your breath, which is very percussive. And then every other context in which I've heard bomba, the drums are so loud. But in this context, I heard the music of the skirt for the first time ever, and what a gift that was. And so I'm curious how you were thinking about sound and silence and stillness inside of this movement piece.
I think there's a lot of answers to that, and the first one is that I like kind of minimal approaches, just in general with the stuff that I make, but I think in particular looking at Black art forms, which for me, I think I see them as so often being treated as spectacle and as like party and celebration, which they certainly are and certainly can be, but for me it's like not everyone actually gets to celebrate, or we're not all celebrating the same thing.
Right. Right.
I'm celebrating, but I'm celebrating that I didn't die today. I'm celebrating something really different. Like, this is not just like a party for me.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to strip down the forms just to their most basic elements, because I really wanted folks to be able to sit with what I think goes sometimes missed or unappreciated or unseen about the art forms, and really have to be kind of confronted with the complexity of what they're doing, which I think sometimes treating something as spectacle kind of, it almost gives you like a safe way to interact with it, and I wanted it to be like not safe. I wanted you to like no, you have to like see it. You have to sit with it. You have to really see it.
Yes.
You're not gonna come away from this and be like, that was so cute, But then I think the other part of it,
You still cute though.
thank you. I think the other part of it, and bomba in particular, the fact that I'm not Puerto Rican, and then the fact that bomba in particular has some very rigid expectations around the tradition and around maintenance of the tradition. It was really important that I also not be doing anything disrespectful and also not like taking the form and doing something with it that I didn't have permission to do. And so spending time with the bomba community and really getting permission from elders in particular to do some of that experimentation was really important. And I thought there might be pushback, or there might be like, that's not okay, or you can try it this way, but this way is not, that's not allowed. And folks were really supportive and really encouraging of that experimentation, which really meant a lot. But even, again, kind of working on it myself and kind of sitting with it myself, I was like, you know, the conversation in bomba is so important. And if I'm taking out the drum, if I'm taking out the music, am I erasing that conversation? And, you know, is that too important of an element to kind of take away? And the more that I experimented, the more it felt like, oh, there's still a conversation happening. It's just not with a drum or not with literal music being played.
Yeah.
It's a conversation between this world and the next one. It's a conversation between ancestors, between different generations. It's a conversation between what we're imagining and what we're actually able to bring into reality. And the more I did it, the more I was like, oh no, there's still a conversation happening here. I didn't take away, or the conversation hasn't left. It's just, it's happening in a different way. And I think I ended up liking that, or that ended up feeling significant with all of the forms. Sort of, what is the conversation that is happening, or what is the, what is the movement interacting with? Because it's still interacting with something, even if it's not music that's literally being played in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, in some of those like more traditional aspects of the art form that you mentioned, you talk a lot about the contradictions of this piece and how it sort of lives comfortably, or maybe not so comfortably, in some of those contradictions. How an art that is a resistance art or a protest art or revolutionary art, like, is still grappling with like these colonial influences, and in bomba in particular, you know, the gender binaries. And here I think like one of the more striking images is you in this like traditional bomba skirt. Can you talk a little bit about how you're playing with that idea of gender and those sort of like more traditional binaries in your exploration here?
Yes, that was super interesting too, because bomba is very, historically, very gender segregated, and lots of rules about gender, both in terms of drumming and the percussion, as well as dance. And Ivelisse Diaz, who is a really important mentor on this piece, is really a pioneer in terms of being a very well-respected woman drummer, because women were historically have not even been allowed to play the drums. So women asserting themselves as drummers is a relatively new and really revolutionary thing in bomba and in the bomba community. And by that same token, men wearing skirts, and usually queer men, and queerness being more actively brought into bomba and into bomba spaces is also very revolutionary. And as a non-binary person, or, you know, someone who identifies outside of the gender binary, that is still sort of not quite a conversation that's happening, or that's kind of new. But again, like, Black Puerto Rican folks are the ones leading those conversations, and there are more and more like trans and non-binary folks taking up space in bomba in these really beautiful and really like art form shifting ways. But yeah, I think I very much identify as a femme, and so like being in a skirt felt really natural and comfortable for me. And then it also has been interesting being in bomba spaces and folks reading that as a man in a skirt, and you know, having to have some like harder conversations about like, no, like, I actually really like wearing a skirt.
Like that?
I like that. And it's really, you know, lots of folks have different experiences. I have not experienced like disrespect or like ostracization or like anything like that. More sort of just folks like trying to understand, and especially like older generation folks being like, I don't really know what you're talking about, but that's great. have a great time.
Yeah, yeah.
I liked how you dance, you know, and that's fine, and that's fine, you know. And my sibling is here, and you know, we've been having some of our own conversations about like, do you even need a word? Does other people understanding your gender or having the same nomenclature for it that you do, like how important is that? Like is that what means you're being seen or not? Because I think I know when I'm being seen and I know when I'm not. And just because someone has the right words does not mean they're inherently seeing you. And just because someone doesn't have the words or doesn't fully like get it, the whole thing, that doesn't mean they're not seeing the core of what's happening. And again, I think you know, I'm not the first person to make this observation, but breaking the gender binary is getting back to our ancestral practices. Rejecting colonial understandings of gender is returning to our roots. It's not a divergence from them. And I think folks in our community and in our ancestry understand that too, even if they don't share the exact same language or sort of a framework. That I think when you're tapping into a nerve, other people feel that. And I think that's what is respected, and that is what is acknowledged. And that feels, again, like more important than like, did you get my pronouns right? You know?
Yeah.
It's cute when you get my pronouns right. But there are things actually like deeper than that and more important than that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Along those lines of nomenclature and categorization, like I think those are some of the modes of capitalism and oppressive technologies. You know, what they thrive on is like the naming, the categorizing, the linear thinking. And the last time that you and I were sort of sitting on a stage like this was, you know, for my play, which was bringing together theater and movement and poetry in a way that, you know, is a lot different from what is happening here, but like in sort of the same hybrid art vocabulary. And then even inside of the hybrid art, these three modes of musicality, gospel, vogue, and bomba, are also mezclas of cultural influences. So I'm curious how you're thinking about that hybridity and that sort of bending of category and blurring those lines of categorization.
Yes. I think it's one of the things that I love about the piece is feeling like this isn't dance, this isn't theater, this isn't poetry, it's something else, and really liking that. And that also kind of feeling just parallel to some of my own experiences as a Black queer person of like truthfully, sometimes it's hard to not have a category, and sometimes it's hard to feel like there isn't really a place for this or for what I'm doing, or I have to make the place for this thing. And as much as, you know, as adept as Black queer people are at doing that, I think it's also like exhausting to have to do that all the time. And I think I'm like having a moment in my own sort of queer journey of like, I'm really tired of like having to create my own spaces all the time and like having to like insist on and prove and assert my existence like all the time. Like I would actually really like to not have to do that.
Yeah.
And I think working on this piece did bring up some of that for me too, of like, I'm very proud of like the lack of categorization, and it's hard in ways that people don't always see and don't always understand. And you're so right that in fact these art forms themselves come out of these mixes and these gray areas and these really complex straddlings of so many different genres and practices, and that really is where all of these art forms come from. And so yeah, I think that's my honest answer, is I do feel like there's something healing in making something that defies category. There's something affirming in making something that defies category, and there's like also something kind of painful too, of like, oh look, here's like another thing that like doesn't really have a place.
What would it look like for you to rest inside of it as opposed to have to like work and assert and carve out?
Good question.
I mean, we're all on the journey.
Really? I think, I mean, honestly, I feel like that's a question I need to sit with, because I feel like, again, it's like connected to so many things I'm sort of processing with, like, in life right now. But yeah, I think, yeah, what does it mean? What does it mean to in some, you know, in certain instances be okay with not being seen or not being understood, and that being okay or maybe even desirable in certain instances, but then also like I do want to be seen sometimes, and like I actually do want to be understood sometimes, and like also I think understanding like that's not a wrong or a bad thing to feel,
Right.
and that belonging or feeling seen and understood, again, like to kind of touch back on what you were saying before, also doesn't need to like necessitate categorization, or also doesn't need to necessitate like, okay, what are the confines of this thing so it can have a clearly carved out place. It's like maybe that's not what I need or mean, but also like being seen and understood is also like a valid thing to want.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I'm really like trying to understand about myself and even my practice in some ways right now.
Yeah. That's
If that makes
valid.
sense.
Yeah.
If that answers the question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and then like my kind of rhetorical question to that is like, how do we find those spaces without having to work for them?
Yeah. Real.
Yeah. And along the lines of space, like you have now done this piece in a lot of different spaces and across many geographies of this city and, you know, hopefully future cities. How does it feel here right now at Steppenwolf in Lincoln Park? Like, what is the significance of this piece being done in this particular geography?
It feels like we're doing a little takeover. It feels like a little bit of a bum rush situation. And I like that. I'm into that. And I really appreciate the LookOut series, and folks at Steppenwolf have been really supportive. And LookOut has been a great fit because it is, by definition, a genre-defying series. And they were really excited and supportive of this piece, which means a lot. So working with the team here has been really great and really easy. And it's been really great and really important to show the piece in different parts of the city and to make sure, I think starting on the west side, starting on the south side also felt very important. And I think though people have come to all of them, so they've all felt cute, you know?
Yes.
But they have all also felt very different, and it being Chicago, you know, where folks felt comfortable going and where they didn't, or, you know, where the different locations kind of changed who the audience was very interesting, and very much changed sort of the shape and the feel of the piece, just even over the last couple of weeks. And we started at Evie's school at La Escuelita on the west side. That was where we kicked it off. And it was so great and it was so much fun. And as soon as you know the piece started and everyone was like kind of quiet, the upstairs neighbors were playing reggaeton really, really loud. And it did throw me off a little bit. I did mess up one part because I got a little distracted. But it was also like, yeah, that's why we did it on the west side.
Right.
Like, that was the whole point. That was the whole point.
A whole new hybridity.
A whole new hybridity. And then it was like, oh, maybe I am dancing to the music, I guess. And it was, but like stuff like that was very cute.
Yeah.
And stuff like that is also unpredictable. And is also why going to where your people are is so important, because different things happen there. Inevitably.
Yeah.
And so like making some space for things like that to happen felt really important and like a very special part of traveling it around to different parts of the city.
Yeah, and what are your visions for future geographies for this piece?
I don't have a specific answer to that question. I really would like to. I've worked hard on it and put a lot of time and love into it. So I definitely want to keep being able to share it with people. And I'm really open to doing that in lots of different ways. I think connecting with Black folks specifically and different parts of the Black diaspora is important. I don't think this piece is for any one group, but I also think it is speaking to specific people and communities and experiences that I want to make sure I'm connecting with. So that matters. But other than that, I think just really getting to share it more. And I would really like, I think, I feel like you're a good person to talk about it with.
I mean, let's talk about it.
I feel like as someone who does art making and organizing, this piece has been very healing for me as an organizer, and also challenging for me. And you know, when we were talking earlier about sort of some of the spiritual challenges, I think very specifically I was spiritually challenged as an organizer, and that a lot of the beliefs and values that I hold really strongly to as an organizer did not hold up in when confronted by these ancestral practices.
Yeah.
And that not being a dismissal or an invalidating of those things, because I think some of those ethics and principles are really important.
Yeah.
But having to realize like, oh, but they don't apply to everything.
Right.
And I think because of the work that we do as organizers, which for me is so much about polarization and about drawing hard lines
Yeah.
and about making people pick a side,
Yeah.
that it was very healing to get to be in a space where I didn't have to operate that way. And I think, again, I think there's people who operate that way all the time. I think there's people who are like, no, you need to practice picking a side. Like, that's your work. You need to get better at that. But for, I think, those of us who are doing that all the time,
Yeah.
getting to sit with more of the gray and sit with more of the nuance and sit with more of the, I actually don't know if this is liberatory or not. I actually don't know if this is oppressive or not, but I'm just gonna sit with it and let it teach me without making that judgment. I think that was really healing for me. And so I say that to say I would really like to actually share this piece with more organizers, and more of the folks, you know, which I would argue is like all Black people.
Right.
But, you know, folks who have to operate in such a fierce way all the time, and in such a clear and sort of razor sharp focused way all the time, that there was something healing and also challenging about having to be in a space where that was not the modus operandi, and
Yeah.
where I had to actually think differently and feel through the process differently. Definitely like challenged a lot of my practices as an organizer in ways that I think were healing.
Yeah. The title, A World After This One, like the first layer that it conjures for me is, you know, when we've won, when we're on the other side of revolution, when we're on the other side of abolition, like when we are building the liberatory oasis of our dreams, like what is the world after this one? But then I think like a quieter entendre for me is like the afterlife and the spiritual world after the embodied world. And I'm curious how you are sort of playing with those two spaces.
Yeah, I definitely think that's like a little bit of the heavier part for me, but it's in there, so let's talk about it. But yeah, I think a lot of where the piece originated for me, again, as an organizer, was thinking about where is the world where Black people are free, and sitting with, I think, particularly gospel. I thought a lot about like, is the world after this one the one that we bring into reality through revolution, or is the world after this one death? And do Black people only get to be free in death, or do we get to be free here? And again, that we actually don't know the answer to that question. That nothing is guaranteed. We're living in such a time of precarity. I would argue like a time of hopelessness, which is not the same as there's no hope, but I think I carry hopelessness all the time. And I think I feel hopelessness all the time, which is a hard feeling or emotion to talk about, because I don't mean it in a nihilistic or a give up way. I mean it in a like, we are interacting with grief constantly, and we're interacting with loss constantly, and we're losing our people constantly, and the fighting is so hard for those of us who are fighting. It's so hard, and I wanted again to actually get to sit with a lack of certainty. I wanted to sit with, I actually don't know what comes after this. I don't know what I'll get to see or not see. And again, in a complicated way, is actually healing to get to occupy that lack of confidence, or that like lack of clarity of like, I don't know if we get there, or like I don't know how we're gonna get there, or how long it's gonna take, or if I'm gonna be there, or you know, like actually getting to sit with the truth of that felt honest in a way that sometimes when you're like constantly being hopeful, you don't get to be honest sometimes about like the actual complicated, hard feelings that you're feeling. And for me, feeling hopelessness is actually human. Instead of seeing it as like giving up, or you know, that not, we're doomed and everything's terrible, that like I just don't have hope every day. I don't have hope every minute of every second of every day, and that's actually normal. And I think when we let ourselves be normal, we actually expand our capacity to fight. And so for me, allowing myself to be a full human and feel the full range of human emotions is like actually sustaining, rather than if I allow myself to feel hopelessness, then I'm gonna give up and I'm not gonna be able to fight anymore. I think I've been learning the opposite thing, that it's unsustainable to suppress your grief, suppress your sadness, and suppress your hopelessness, and that actually sustaining myself in the fight requires me to feel those things. And I think this piece was a piece where I got to express a lot of grief, but I also got to sit with hopelessness, actually, which is, again, a complicated thing to talk about, but for me really important to name that, like, I don't know what the world after this one is, and I don't know how we get there, and I don't know if I'm going to see it. And that, for me, makes me that much more committed to fighting for it, rather than feel pointless or feel like giving up and not doing anything, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for doing that work.
I really do think, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I really do think it's one of the ways that Black people are not allowed to be people. I really do think it's one of the ways that Black people have superhuman expectations placed on us, that we don't get to feel hopeless, that all these horrible things are done to us constantly, and we're supposed to just be resilient, and we're supposed to just keep going and keep fighting. It's like, that's unrealistic. It's unfair, and I am deeply committed to the fight.
Yeah.
And I think the older I get, the more I learn, like, oh, the rest, the quiet, the really actually getting to inhabit all of my full feelings is how you sustain yourself. You can't keep going if you're denying how heavy and how hard and how difficult this is. That actually acknowledging that and letting yourself feel that is what is sustaining, actually. Because it's unfair. It's an unfair, superhuman expectation for yourself to just have to keep going in the face of everything that we are carrying.
Yeah.
And rest is actually important. And like actually seeing hopelessness as a kind of rest. You know, Miriam Kaba says hope is a discipline. And I think what gets left out of that is any discipline requires off days. Any discipline requires off days. And those days where you actually get to rest are important for rebuilding your energy and your strength, and seeing what we kind of sometimes see as negative emotions as actually part of that process, part of like a cyclical process of actually rebuilding your strength and rebuilding your capacity to keep fighting.
Thank you for allowing us to witness you in that. I have no concept of time right now, so I don't know how we're doing on time.
I don't either.
I'm wondering how you're feeling about taking questions or comments from the audience, or if you want to have conversations.
We can do that. We could do some questions.
Okay.
If folks gotta leave, that's okay.
I'd also say you can also join us at the bar too afterwards to talk more.
Thank you. A question.
A question.
I wanted to follow up on what you were just saying. Did you, in your research and your practice, see these dance forms as moments where our ancestors
definitely. And I think, yes, I think all of these art forms are doing that in some ways. And I think Vogue, in some ways, is the art form here that I feel like I kind of have the most intimate relationship with. And I think Vogue very much did that for me at a certain point in my own growth and in my own trajectory, was really teaching myself what freedom feels like, specifically for a Black, queer, gender non-conforming person. And it is, once you know that feeling, then you can't accept anything less than that. And I think these art forms are these really powerful tools for, in the moment, carving out a reality of acceptance, of freedom, of breath. And it is invigorating in this way that it's like, oh, I want to feel like that all the time. And how does the world need to change so that I can feel that? So the way that I just felt for those 5 minutes while I was dancing, what needs to change about the world so that I can feel that way all the time? And I do think that is also the power of these art forms too, is yes, we're there's this far off world that we're trying to get to, and we can create it, even if it's briefly, even if it's momentarily, even if it's in one room for a limited amount of time. We can create a vision for what it is that we're fighting towards, which I think is absolutely necessary for sustaining yourself, to like actually be able to like see or feel something, even if it's just a flash, that you're like, okay, so this is possible. So feeling this way is possible.
Yes.
What has to change about everything else?
Yes.
So that the way the space we created in this room or in the cipher, in this bombazo, is the way it feels all the time.
Yes. Beloveds, thank yourselves for getting yourself here. Thank you, Benji, for sharing all that you shared, for giving your gifts to us. And feel free to continue the conversation out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Kristiana. Thank you so much to Benny and to Vera Marie. And thank you so much to Lauren and Matt and all the folks at the LookOut series who made this possible. Thank you also so much for being here and for coming.